In 1929, a trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal published a story that would fool the world for almost a century. The article, titled A Saga of Cathay, claimed that a sailor aboard Marco Polo's ship had met a beautiful woman on the coast of China who was making long, thin strands of dough and cooking them in boiling water. The sailor brought this discovery back to his captain, and Marco Polo supposedly introduced pasta to Italy when the ship returned to Venice in 1295. The story even gave the fictional sailor a name. They called him Spaghetti. What nobody knew at the time was that the National Macaroni Manufacturers Association had completely invented the tale as a marketing gimmick to sell more pasta to American consumers, and it worked. The myth spread into school classrooms, into dinner conversations, and eventually into a 1938 Hollywood film called The Adventures of Marco Polo, where Gary Cooper sat in a Chinese home and asked about the dish he was being served. His host called it spaghetti, but pasta was already being mass-produced and exported across the Mediterranean, more than 140 years before Marco Polo ever stepped back on Venetian soil. The most Italian food on the planet was never Italian to begin with, and the real story of where it came from is far stranger than any myth a trade magazine could dream up. The oldest known noodles on Earth were not found in a kitchen or a marketplace or a royal pantry. They were found under 3 meters of earthquake rubble in a disaster site along the upper reaches of the Yellow River in northwestern China. In 2002, archaeologists working at the Lajia settlement in Qinghai province were excavating the remains of a community that had been destroyed by a catastrophic earthquake and flood roughly 4,000 years ago. The disaster happened so suddenly that it preserved the settlement almost like a snapshot, freezing the details of daily life beneath thick layers of ancient sediment. Bodies were found huddled together. Pottery was scattered mid-use, and among the ruins, the team uncovered an overturned earthenware bowl buried deep in the rubble. When they carefully turned the bowl over and brushed away the compacted dirt, they found thin yellow strands sitting at the bottom, curled and brittle but unmistakable in shape. Noodles. The archaeologist who made the discovery, Ye Maolin, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, recognized immediately what he was looking at. He carefully placed the noodle remains back into the bowl, sealed the whole thing to prevent contamination, and transported it to a laboratory in Beijing. For 2 years, the noodles sat waiting for proper analysis, preserved in a climate-controlled storage facility, while researchers debated how to examine such fragile ancient material without destroying it. Then, in 2004, Professor Lu Hoiyuan from the Institute of Geology and Geophysics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences began his examination. Using phytolith analysis, which identifies plant species from tiny mineral particles left behind in plant cells, and starch grain testing, Lu determined exactly what the noodles were made from. The results were published in the journal Nature in 2005, and they rewrote what the world thought it knew about the history of food. The noodles were made from 2 types of millet, broomcorn millet and foxtail millet, grains indigenous to northern China that had been cultivated in the region for at least 7,000 years. The millet flour had been ground into a fine powder, mixed with water to form a dough, and most likely pulled and stretched by hand into long, thin strands, a technique that still exists in Chinese ramen noodles today. Radiocarbon dating placed the noodles at roughly 4,000 years old, belonging to a people called the Qijia culture, who lived along the terraces above the Yellow River. Archaeochemist Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania called the find quite amazing and noted that even today, considerable skill is required to make long, thin noodles like those found at Lajia. Someone in ancient China was hand-pulling noodles along the banks of the Yellow River roughly 2,000 years before the founding of Rome. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Before you declare China the birthplace of all pasta, there is one critical detail that changes the entire equation. These ancient millet noodles and the pasta that would eventually conquer Italy are, by nearly every credible historical account, completely unrelated inventions. Chinese noodles were made with soft wheat and millet. Italian pasta, the kind that could be dried on wooden racks under the sun, stored in barrels for months, shipped across the Mediterranean on trading vessels, and boiled weeks later without disintegrating, requires an entirely different grain. Durum wheat. Durum wheat is harder, denser, and packed with a high concentration of gluten, which gives dried pasta its structure, its satisfying chew, and its ability to hold a shape through vigorous boiling. Soft wheat cannot do that. Food historian Barbara Santich from the University of Adelaide has been direct on this point. Chinese noodles were made with soft wheat because China only had soft wheat back then, she explained. They could not have created dried pasta. So Chinese noodles did not evolve into what is now known as Mediterranean pasta, and pasta did not make its way from China to Italy. The conflation of noodles and pasta, treating them as the same food simply because they both involve long strands of cooked dough, is exactly what allowed the Marco Polo myth to survive unchallenged for so long. If pasta and noodles are interchangeable, then someone must have carried one invention to the other. But if they are parallel creations born from different grains in different civilizations with no proven contact between them, the whole narrative collapses. And it does. Food can arise independently in different places at different times with no connection whatsoever. Think about bread. Think about beer. Think about dumplings. Simple combinations of grain, water, and heat are among the most obvious things any hungry civilization can invent. And multiple cultures across the ancient world did exactly that, separately, over thousands of years. Now, some historians have tried to push the origins of Italian pasta even further back, past the Arabs, past the Silk Road, all the way to ancient Rome and the Etruscans. There is a relief carving from an Etruscan tomb dating to around the 4th century, before the Common Era, that some scholars have interpreted as showing pasta-making equipment. Rolling pins, cutting boards, what might be a drying rack, but the evidence is flimsy. Even if the tools were used for cooking, they were almost certainly for making a food called testaroli, an ancient flatbread and pasta hybrid that is still eaten in parts of Tuscany and Liguria today. Testaroli is made by pouring batter onto a hot surface and cooking it into a crepe-like disc, then cutting the disc into diamond shapes and briefly boiling them. It is delicious, but it is not pasta in any modern sense of the word. The Romans also ate something called lagan, thin sheets of dough that were baked or fried rather than boiled. The Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius from the 1st century mentions lagane as a way to layer dough with meat and sauce, something closer to a proto-lasagna than to spaghetti. But baked sheets of dough are a long way from the dried, boiled, extruded pasta that would later conquer the world. The critical innovation, drying pasta so that it could be stored and transported, belonged to the Arabs. So if pasta did not travel from China to Italy in the luggage of a Venetian merchant, how did it actually arrive on Italian shores? The answer involves a group of traders and conquerors who rarely get the credit they deserve in this story. For centuries, Arab merchants and travelers had been crisscrossing the vast deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, following trade routes that stretched from the markets of Baghdad to the port cities of the Mediterranean coast. These journeys could take weeks or months, and travelers needed food that would survive the brutal conditions. Fresh bread goes stale within days, cooked grains rot in the heat, but dried strips of dough made from hard durum wheat and water, rolled thin, cut into shapes, and packed into cloth bundles on the backs of camels, could last for months without any refrigeration at all. By the 9th century, Arab cooks had perfected a product called itriya, long, thin strands of dried dough made from durum wheat that could be stored indefinitely and boiled in water whenever a meal was needed. A 9th century text, written by Ibn al-Mibrad from what is now modern Iraq, describes boiled dough strips resembling vermicelli, one of the earliest clear written references to something we would recognize as pasta. The word itriya itself leaves a trail of linguistic breadcrumbs across civilizations. Scholars have traced it back through Arabic to an even older Greek word, itri or itria, which described a flour and water dough rolled into thin sheets and cut into strips. Syria was once a Greek colony, and as the Greek language mixed with Arabic over centuries of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, the word and the recipe traveled together across the ancient world. There is also the Persian word lakhsha, meaning slippery, which described noodles across much of the Middle East and Central Asia. That Persian word migrated eastward to Indonesia, where it became laksa, and westward into Eastern Europe, where versions of it still survive in Hungarian as laska, in Russian as lapsha, in Ukrainian as lokshina, and in Lithuanian as lakstinii. The dried pasta that the world now considers quintessentially Italian was, for centuries, a product of the Arabic-speaking world and the enormous trade networks that connected the Middle East to every corner of the Mediterranean basin. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains how pasta landed in Europe for good. The Arabs did not just trade dried pasta along desert caravan routes. They conquered their way into Europe with it. In the 9th century, Muslim forces from North Africa invaded and occupied Sicily, the large triangular island sitting at the strategic crossroads of the Mediterranean Sea. They brought with them durum wheat seeds, advanced irrigation systems, sugarcane, citrus trees, and their dried pasta. Sicily's hot sunshine and constant coastal breezes turned out to be absolutely ideal for drying pasta outdoors on wooden racks, and within a few generations, the island had transformed into a major production hub. The earliest clear written reference to pasta production anywhere in Western Europe comes not from an Italian source, but from an Arab geographer. In 1154, a scholar named Muhammad al-Idrisi, working in the court of the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, completed a massive geographical work called the Book of Roger. In it, he described the town of Trabia, just outside the capital city of Palermo, where he observed that a large quantity of pasta was produced and exported to Calabria and to other Muslim and Christian territories. Pasta was already being manufactured at an industrial scale and shipped internationally from Sicilian workshops before the 1300s even began. Commercial contracts from the city of Genoa between 1157 and 1160, recorded by a notary named Giovanni Scriba, confirm large-scale imports of Sicilian pasta into the Italian mainland. Genoa, which would later build its own reputation as a pasta capital, was, in those early centuries, primarily a buyer and distributor. The product arriving on Genoese trading ships had been developed under Arab rule, dried under the Sicilian sun, and traded along shipping routes that connected the coast of North Africa to the harbors of mainland Europe. And this was not an isolated import. The Arab presence in Sicily fundamentally reshaped the island's agriculture, language, and entire culinary identity in ways that persist to this day. Many Sicilian words for food have Arabic roots that are still in common use. The island's famous cassata cake takes its name from the Arabic word casa, meaning bowl. The granita that tourists line up for on the streets of Palermo descends from the Arabic sharbat, a sweetened iced drink. Sicilian couscous, which many Italians are surprised to learn even exists, is a direct inheritance from North African Arab cooking. And the dried pasta that would eventually come to define Italian identity on the world stage was born in this exact cultural collision, at the intersection of Arab ingenuity and Sicilian geography. One document in particular puts the final nail in the Marco Polo myth. A will dated 1279, written by a Genoese soldier named Ponzio Bastone, includes among his possessions a basket of macaroni, valuable enough to bequeath to his heirs. Pasta was listed alongside clothing, furniture, and other household goods, suggesting it was a common pantry staple, not some exotic novelty. That legal document was drafted while Marco Polo was still somewhere in the vast territory of the Mongol Empire, years before his return to Venice. Pasta was not just present in Italy before Marco Polo came home. It was ordinary enough and valued enough to appear in routine inheritance paperwork. By the Middle Ages, pasta had spread across the Italian peninsula, but it was still a secondary food, often served as a side dish alongside roasted meats for wealthy households, or eaten plain with a bit of salt and cheese by the poor. During this period, Italians developed the close association between pasta and grated cheese, particularly Parmesan from the Emilia-Romagna region, a pairing so old that food historian Massimo Montanari has written that it is impossible to understand the history of Parmesan without understanding the history of pasta. The two products evolved in parallel, each driving demand for the other. The city that finally elevated pasta from a regional staple into a national symbol was Naples. During the 1600s, Neapolitan engineers and craftsmen developed a revolutionary method of mechanically extruding dough through bronze dies, pressing enormous quantities of wheat paste through perforated metal plates using massive hand-cranked screw presses. Before this innovation, every strand of pasta was shaped by hand, which was slow, inconsistent, and too expensive to feed an entire city. The bronze die changed the economics of pasta overnight. Suddenly, dried spaghetti and macaroni could be produced cheaply and quickly enough to fill the bellies of a rapidly growing urban population. Naples in the 1700s and 1800s was one of the largest and most densely populated cities in all of Europe. A chaotic, noisy place packed with working-class laborers who needed affordable, filling food. Pasta was the answer. Streets across the city became lined with open-air vendors selling bowls of plain macaroni for pennies, and with massive wooden drying racks, where long golden strands of spaghetti hung in neat rows, swaying in the warm breeze blowing off the Bay of Naples. European travelers who visited Naples during this period wrote about the spectacle with a mixture of fascination and horror. They described Neapolitans eating long noodles with their bare hands in the street, tilting their heads back and lowering endless strands into their open mouths. The fork had not yet become standard eating equipment for pasta. By the 1800s, Neapolitans had fully claimed the nickname Mangia Macaroni, the macaroni eaters, a title originally given to the Sicilians who had pioneered the product centuries earlier. The Italian playwright Carlo Goldoni, living in Paris in the late 1700s, recalled hearing Frenchmen joke that it was pointless to offer an Italian anything but pasta. Macaroni, macaroni, macaroni. Even the great Italian statesman Camillo Benso di Cavour, on the eve of unifying southern Italy with the north, supposedly declared that the macaroni are cooked and we will eat them. But all of this was still happening without the single ingredient that most of the world now considers utterly inseparable from the dish. There were no tomatoes. Before the arrival of the tomato, pasta was dressed with grated cheese, melted butter, olive oil, or nothing at all beyond a pinch of salt. Wealthy Renaissance aristocrats sometimes paired pasta with elaborate mixtures that would sound bizarre today, including sugar, cinnamon, raisins, and even meat from cow udders. The sauces of pre-tomato Italy were white, brown, or green, built from nuts, animal fat, herb pastes, and aged cheeses. The tomato itself arrived in Europe from the Americas in the mid-1500s, likely entering Italy through the port city of Naples, which was under Spanish colonial rule at the time. But Europeans were afraid of it. The tomato belongs to the nightshade family, closely related to plants that can kill you, and for roughly 2 centuries after its arrival, most Europeans refused to put it anywhere near their mouths. They called it pomodoro, the golden apple, because the first varieties to reach Italian shores were small and yellow, not the fat red globes we know today. Wealthy collectors grew tomatoes in ornamental gardens as curiosities. Herbalists speculated about their supposed love potion properties. Almost nobody actually cooked with them. It took until the late 1600s for adventurous cooks in southern Italy to finally start experimenting. The first known published reference to any kind of tomato sauce in Italian cooking appeared in a 1692 cookbook called Lo Scalco alla Moderna, written by Neapolitan chef Antonio Latini. But the specific pairing that would change world cuisine forever, pasta dressed with tomato sauce, did not appear in any written record until 1790 in a cookbook called L'Appiccio Moderno by chef Francesco Leonardi. Think about that for a second. The dish that billions of people consider the absolute definition of Italian food, spaghetti with red sauce, has existed in print for only about 235 years. The United States of America is older than pasta with tomato sauce. That is not a typo, by the way. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. The tomato transformed everything about how Italians related to pasta. It added vivid color, sharp brightness, and an acidity that balanced the dense starchiness of the noodles perfectly. It was cheap. It grew abundantly in the rich volcanic soil surrounding Naples and Mount Vesuvius, and it could be preserved for the winter by sun-drying it into a thick, concentrated paste called estrato. The marriage of pasta and tomato was never some grand culinary master plan. It was a pure accident of geography and economics. A South American fruit happened to land in a European port city that already had a centuries-old tradition of eating dried Arab wheat noodles, and eventually someone put the two together on the same plate. One of pasta's earliest fans outside of Italy was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. During the 1780s, Jefferson served as the American minister to France and used that posting to travel extensively through Italy. When he reached Naples, he became genuinely obsessed. Jefferson filled his travel journals with detailed observations about the pasta-making process, noting the specific durum wheat flour called semola, the mechanics of the bronze extrusion presses, and the exact method by which dough was forced through perforated metal plates to create long, uniform strands. He even sketched diagrams of the machines, drawing careful cross-sections that showed how a screw mechanism pushed dough downward through the die. In February of 1789, Jefferson wrote to his private secretary William Short, asking him to find and purchase a macaroni mold. The machine eventually arrived at Jefferson's estate at Monticello in Virginia, and he used it to produce pasta for his guests. During his presidency, Jefferson served macaroni and cheese at White House dinners, introducing the dish to many Americans who had never encountered it before. His handwritten pasta recipe survives at the Library of Congress to this day. 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 wine glasses of milk, 2 pounds of flour, a little salt. Work them together without water, and very well. Jefferson planted the seed, but the real explosion of pasta in America came decades later, driven by desperation and poverty rather than presidential dinner parties. Starting in the 1880s, millions of Italians, the vast majority from the poorest southern regions of the country, began leaving their homeland in search of better lives abroad. In the 1880s alone, roughly 300,000 Italians arrived in the United States. By the 1890s, that number had nearly doubled to 600,000. These immigrants came from Naples, Sicily, Calabria, Puglia, and the broader Mezzogiorno, exactly the regions where dried pasta had been the everyday staple of every meal for generations. They packed spaghetti and macaroni into their trunks and suitcases. They carried recipes in their memories. And they brought their deep, almost spiritual connection to this food with them across the Atlantic Ocean. In neighborhoods like Little Italy in Lower Manhattan, the North End in Boston, and the Hill in St. Louis, Italian immigrants opened grocery stores and small restaurants that introduced millions of Americans to pasta for the first time. The first pasta factory in America had actually been established back in 1848 by a Frenchman named Antoine Zarega in Brooklyn, New York. But it was the enormous wave of Italian immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s that transformed pasta from an obscure specialty product into a mainstream American food. By the 1920s and 30s, spaghetti and meatballs, a dish that barely existed in Italy itself, had become a standard meal in American homes from coast to coast. The same pattern repeated everywhere Italian immigrants settled across the globe. In Buenos Aires, Italians brought pasta to Argentina, where it merged with local beef culture to create dishes like tallarines con tuco. In Sao Paulo, they brought it to Brazil. In Melbourne and Sydney, they brought it to Australia. Wherever Italians went, pasta went with them, packed in their luggage and woven into the fabric of every community they built. And because the people who carried pasta to every corner of the world were Italian, the food became permanently and irreversibly Italian in the eyes of everyone who tasted it. The earlier chapters of the story, the Chinese millet noodles, the Arab itria, the Sicilian workshops running under Muslim governors, all of it was quietly buried under the sheer weight of Italian cultural identity. But pasta's global spread actually started before the immigration waves during an era called the Grand Tour. In the 1700s and 1800s, wealthy young men from England, France, and Germany traveled through Italy as a rite of passage, visiting Roman ruins, Florentine galleries, and Neapolitan markets. They ate pasta on the streets of Naples and in the dining rooms of Roman palazzi, and many of them brought the taste home with them. The English poet Lord Byron ate pasta during his years living in Italy, and the word macaroni itself entered English slang as a term for a fashionable, somewhat ridiculous young man who adopted too many continental affectations. If you have ever wondered what Yankee Doodle meant when he stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni, that is the connection. Macaroni meant trendy, affected, absurdly European. It was a pasta reference embedded in a Revolutionary War song, and almost nobody realizes that today. Even within Italy, pasta's dominance was not universally celebrated. In the 1930s, at the height of Mussolini's fascist regime, the futurist art movement launched a bizarre campaign against pasta. The futurist leader, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, published a manifesto calling for the abolition of pasta from the Italian diet, claiming it made people heavy, slow, pessimistic, and brutish. The futurists wanted Italy to embrace speed, machinery, and modernity. They saw pasta as a symbol of laziness and backwardness. The Italian public responded with outrage. Pasta survived the futurist assault without a scratch, and the episode only deepened the nation's attachment to the food that had by then become its most recognizable symbol on the world stage. And that is the deep irony sitting at the center of this entire story. Pasta is Italian in the same way the English language is English. Yes, England is where the language was formalized, codified in dictionaries, standardized by grammarians, and exported to every continent on the globe. But English itself is built on Germanic roots, French vocabulary, Latin grammar, Greek scientific terms, and Old Norse slang brought by Viking invaders. It is a mongrel language that absorbed everything it touched and made it all sound like it had always belonged. Pasta works exactly the same way. Chinese hands first pulled noodles from millet dough 4,000 years ago along the banks of the Yellow River. Arab traders dried durum wheat strips into portable food that could survive brutal desert crossings and long ocean voyages. Sicilian manufacturers under Arab rule scaled up production under the Mediterranean sun. Neapolitan engineers mechanized the whole process with bronze dies and massive screw presses. A South American fruit arrived in a European port by colonial accident and stayed forever. And Italian immigrants carried the finished product to every inhabited continent on Earth. Nobody owns pasta. Everybody built it. What survives is not who made it first, but what it became after passing through so many different hands over so many centuries. Today, there are more than 300 recognized shapes of pasta in Italy alone, and new ones are still being invented. The long golden strands of spaghetti from the south, the tiny ear-shaped orecchiette of Puglia pressed individually by thumb against rough wooden boards, the stuffed pockets of tortellini from Emilia-Romagna that legend says were inspired by the navel of the goddess Venus, the ridged tubes of rigatoni eaten in Roman trattorias with pagata or cacio e pepe. Every region of Italy has its own signature shapes, its own preferred sauces, and its own fierce opinions about the correct way to cook and eat them. These are not minor variations. Italians will argue for hours about whether carbonara should contain guanciale or pancetta, whether you break spaghetti before putting it in the pot, and whether cream belongs anywhere near a pasta dish. The passion is real, and it runs deep. Each shape evolved in a specific region to pair with a specific local sauce, and each one carries a history that reaches far beyond the borders of the country that now claims it. Pasta is not a single invention by a single civilization. It is a collaboration that took 4,000 years, 3 continents, and dozens of cultures to complete. And that might be the most Italian thing about it. Because if there is one thing Italian culture has proven over and over across the centuries, it is that Italians possess an extraordinary genius for taking the best of what arrives on their shores and making it unmistakably, permanently, beautifully their own. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which food origin story you want us to cover next.